from the clearing, I would like to present Jens Jensen. And Jens, at this point in his life, when you see him in a minute, he is 86 years old, and he has started the clearing in Ellison Bay because he needed something to do. So, okay. And with that, with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Jens Jensen.
I have been walking with the sunlight, and as I come through the woods, into the clearing, the wildflowers are there to meet me, and my heart is warmed. It has been a long time ago that I first came to Door County. I was looking for a place in the country. We had the Model T, made by a gentleman named Henry Ford. Perhaps you've heard of him. He sold a lot of these. And I'm driving north, and Anna Marie is in the passenger seat, of course, and Myrtha Fulkerson, my secretary, is in the back with the children. And as we come up towards Ellison Bay, this little town, for the first time, I got to the top of the hill, and you know what I saw? I looked out over this bluff off into the lake, the Green Bay, and I was looking west, so I knew the sun would set before me. And there was a bluff with a forest on top. It looked just like my childhood home in Dibble, Denmark. And as we're driving in, I went, Anna! And I took my hands off the steering wheel, and we drove into the ditch. I was so excited. I was so excited. Very, very, very excited. You know, years go by, and I established a folk school in Ellison Bay. It's called The Clearing. Maybe you have heard of it, and I would like you to come up and see me sometime. Myrtha will make you some tea or coffee and perhaps something German because she likes that kind of food. I'm Danish, so you know what I like. The clearing is a place where I now live. And it is a school where I want students to come and find themselves. Well, when we were up there, before I moved up there, all the time, we would meet with the Telfers in town. And he was a young man then, in 1924, young strapping man doing things in the orchard. And sometimes we would carry a picnic over to see the Toft family, Thomas and Juliana. And they had 7 children, a few more than me and Anna. But at that time, there was a woman in the family. She was a woman then, and her name was, of course, Miss Emma. And she was already teaching school, first up in Rowley's Bay, and then she went out across the prairie, which of course warms my heart, and she taught in North Dakota and Iowa, and then came back. Well, I want to tell you, I was not always here in Ellison Bay and in Door County. When I came across the ocean, I did so for a very specific reason. You see, I fell in love with a woman who was working in our household in Dibble. Her parents had passed on, and you cannot control the heart, you know, and sometimes the heart goes where logic says no. But sometimes it does go in the right direction, and this time it did. So, you know, my father, though, I was supposed to inherit the farm, and he did not approve of my love for this woman who was working in our house because she had no parents. He called her a town girl, But she was wonderful. Her laughter warmed the day, and her bright, smart eyes always there to greet me, except when Father was there. Then she would get a scowl. So it turned out that when I was to inherit the farm, Father said, "No!" Now my younger brothers had already chosen other jobs, and I would not be a farmer. As you can see in a moment, that was okay with me. But this meant there was nothing for me in Denmark. So as my ancestors did thousands and thousands of years before, when they migrated west and south, I had to migrate as well. But the immense body of water, the ocean, was in my way, so we had to come across the sea. And we came across the sea, and I had 15 cents in my pocket. Well, I eventually got work in Chicago. There were some other jobs, but we won't talk about them. So I got to Chicago, and it would be some time before the Jensen name would be established in Chicago. Now, Chicago in the late 1800s was an industrial boom town. It was growing very rapidly. And I had learned from being overseas about parks. And when I looked at Chicago, what I saw was these stretches of grass that were mowed. There would be a lonely tree out there all by its lonesome. And over here, there would be a wading pool for children in the hot sun, which was no fun. And there would be nothing that would really rejuvenate the people working in the city. You see, the people working in Chicago at the time were grinding away their lives in the mills and the factories. This is not how we should live. So I wanted to bring the wilderness back into the city, you see. Bring nature to the people. And we can do this in the parks. So I got a job with the park department. I had a 3-wheel cart and a shovel, and I would follow around the horses picking up what they left behind. The rich people would walk by, and they would look down at me and scowl, and some of them would laugh. But not me. I am overjoyed. I have a job, and it is outside. Those rich people are working in offices at desks. I do not want to do that. So I am the lucky one. And in time, guess what? I got promoted, and I became the gardener of the Chicago parks. Well, this is important, you see. When I was a young man in Denmark, I was conscripted into Kaiser Wilhelm's Royal Guard in the 1800s and sent to Berlin, Germany. Now, the Germans were trying to take more territory from Denmark, and we did not approve of that. We were under their rule because of where Dibble is in the southern part of Denmark, and I had to go. I did not want to, but I went to Berlin, and I was surprised. You know what I found? This beautiful city. It had 1 million people in it. 1 million people in this city. And there were formal parks of the French design everywhere. So I would go around the city making sketches of the parks. And then one day, I found a river coming through Berlin that was forgotten by everybody in a park that had wild flowers blossoming all by their lonesome along the riverbank, and nobody was there. So, guess what? I found a refuge. And it's there that I went to forget about the war and forget about strife. And I drew pictures of nature coming into the city. And this is what I brought to Chicago, you see? So, looking at these parks, now, they were just a bunch of exotic plantings, and I believe that you have to communicate with the soil. It is the soil that instructs us what to do. And the plants that grow here naturally understand this soil. And in understanding the soil, they can survive things like drought and floods, right? They put up with this stuff because that's where they grew up. Just like you might have grown up someplace and you put up with that place, right? So do the plants. So, guess what? I went out and I would dig up the plants in the prairie off to the west of Chicago and bring them into the city and plant them in the park. And sometimes I would collect the seeds from all these prairie plants, and as I walked through other parks, I would broadcast them in the wind, and when the wildflowers came up in the spring, they'd say, "Where did these weeds come from?" And I would say, "Weeds? These are the native plants. We should have these plants here." I was very insistent about this. Well, there were many people in Chicago at the time, and I met an architect named Louis Sullivan. He was a transcendental philosopher architect. You'll figure it out. And he loved Walt Whitman. He carried around him Leaves of Grass that was read so many times that the pages were gray and brown from the dirt from his fingers and his pencils as he drew architectural diagrams. Well, in his office was a young man named Frank Lloyd Wright. He was an interesting man, but he had a very severe mother who was an expert in teaching the philosophy for children of Frederick Froebel. Now, maybe you know Frederick Froebel. He is the man that decided we should have kindergartens. Now, kindergartens are for young people to learn. And he said what a child should do is have a bunch of blocks and build things out of these blocks because he's using his own head, huh? And he's innovating. He's thinking about how can I make something out of nothing? And this is what Frank Lloyd Wright got started on as a child. Some of you have seen some of his buildings, and this is starting to make sense. So there we were. There is a group called the Chicago Group, and I was in that office as well for a while. But I like the prairie. You see, on some days, I go west of Chicago. And remember, I grew up on the sea. And the immensity of the sea was replaced by the great plains of North America. You know, some days in the spring, the black-eyed Susan were so numerous for acres and acres that they seemed to be reflected in the sky. And I would stand there, tears streaming down my eyes, because I could feel the spiritual power of the prairie coming off the earth, out of the soil. This is what the Indians felt, and this is what we must reconnect with in nature so that we can rejuvenate ourselves and learn how to treat nature. Do you understand? Now, this prairie extends to the horizon, and you have a horizontal horizon in the prairie. And where the rivers through the prairie and the streams through the prairie, they meander gently and flow slowly. And they gently flow down bluffs. And as they flow down the bluffs, there's a magic little tinkling sound of water. It is peaceful, you see. And in this way, I realized we can bring nature to the people in the cities, and Frank Lloyd Wright and other architects started using this concept in their buildings, and we call it prairie style. So it turned out, after the years, that Anna Marie passed away in 1934. I had been with her always. And I was not sure what to do. I was in our studio in Ravinia, and one day, snowy day, I stomped in and brushed the snow off my jacket, and I stood there, and Myrta Fulkerson came at me and said, "Mr. Jensen, what will you do now?" And I said, "I am going to the clearing." So I gave the firm to the 2 landscape architects that I had hired, and we went north. Now, Myrta Fulkerson, she's 5'2", and she's got a stiff upper lip, I can tell you that. Now, I hired her when she was all of 19 years old. She came into the Ravinia studio, and she looked wide-eyed at this stuff, piles of paper and rolls of drawings everywhere, and she said, "Mr. Jensen, what would you have me do here?" And I said, "Organize it all." And she did not argue, so I liked her immediately. Well, she was a young girl then, and in the Ravinia studio, many of my friends would stop by. You know, Chicago is a big city, but it's a small city too, because, you know, there's a small group of people that understand the Prairie School, and there's a small group of people that understand native landscaping, and that was us. And so, guess what we did? We would bring our friends into the studio and meet them in the parks. They were singers, they were poets. They were landscape architects and architects. They were blacksmiths and shoemakers. They were dancers and singers. Everybody. This was almost too much some days for Myrta, because she had never seen anything like this. So one day, one of my friends, his name was Vachel Lindsay, came into the studio, and he's a poet. He is a poet of society, you see. And I had gone out to the prairie one day with him, and he looked out over the prairie, and as he gazed to the horizon, he wept. And he said, "Jensen, this goes on forever." Now, we were lucky enough to see this when it was still a wilderness. And he wrote a poem. Can I read it for you? Now, the thing about Vachel is he believed that poetry should be sung. The flower-fed buffalo on the spring, in the days of long ago, ranged where the locomotives sing and the prairie flower lies low. The tossing, the blooming, the perfume grass is swept away by the wheat, and wheels and wheels and wheels spin by, but the spring still is sweet. But the flower-fed buffalo of spring left us long ago. They gore no more. They bellow no more. They trundle around the hills no more, with the black feet lying low and the Pawnee lying low, lying low, lying low. Because he understood that the wilderness was vanishing before our eyes. And it is incumbent upon us who see this to react and act and do something to stop the loss of the nature the loss of the wilderness. This is very critical that we, as a civilization, protect that from which we came. We moved up to Ellison Bay in 1935, and Myrta said she would not go because there was no plumbing and there was no running water. There was a lot of fish in Green Bay, but she did not want to hike down the cliff and get them and bring them up. You know, she's 5'2", the legs are short. So she would grumble and complain and says, I will not go, I will not go. And I said, Myrta, 1 year only, huh? Just 1 year. You try it out. If you do not like it, go back to Willamette. She didn't know it was coming. so she comes up there, and now she's a worker, I tell you. She can do anything, and she's a very good cook in the kitchen. And she got into the kitchen, and I thought it was a kitchen. She said it was a disaster area because there was no running water. She had to carry the garbage out far away so that the animals would not come into the lodge, and there was no toilets or plumbing or anything. But you know what? She stayed. Now, in those early years, Emma Toft had come home. You see, she had gone down to Chicago after being a school teacher to learn about nursing. And, well, she was only starting her studies when her father, Thomas, a friend of mine, he became ill. And so she came home to help. You know, that's what we did back then. When the parents needed help, we came home, except my parents didn't need help, so I stayed here. That was a good move, huh? So she had changed a lot since I had seen her a long time ago. When Emma walks, it is like she is gliding, she is floating. She is floating through the woods. She tells me when I come over to see her place in Toft Point, mind where you put your foot. There is somebody living there. Walk lightly. And she would write me little poems. And one said, touch with your eyes, but do not pick up with your fingers. You know, she loved the wildflowers, and she did not want anybody to pick them because she said if you pick them, what will you pick next? The stream? And then if you pick the stream, you pick all the woods, and pretty soon you're picking the bluffs and the land and the lake, and there's nothing left. Besides, where would you put all this stuff, huh? She was a tall, upright woman with an intelligent demeanor about her, and she conveyed respect to you. She respected nature, but there was a little bit of vinegar in Emma. If you had ideas that did not collaborate with hers, she would let you have it. Now, this woman was a working woman. You look at her hands, and there's calluses on these hands, and her knuckles are starting to get gnarled because of all the work she does outside, and they're strong hands from picking up firewood and tending the garden. And when she would grab onto your hand, you knew it. I had seen more than one man cower at the strength of Emma Toft. She was a lot like her father, Thomas. Now, Thomas was a hard-working Dane with a stiff upper lip. And one day Emma said to me, you know, Jensen, sometimes you are a little bit boastful. I didn't think so at all. I mean, I really did all those parks just the way I said. But she said, you are boastful. And I said, well, he says, if my father was still alive, he would straighten you out immediately. That was Emma. I'm telling you. I believed her. You know, he bought the 40. He bought it before the lumberjacks had gotten in there. And so the forest had not been cut. This is rare, you know. Sometimes, during many days, many years, I would travel from Ellison Bay in a clearing over to Bailey's Harbor here. And when I come over the backbone of Door County, I could see no trees. I could see the Lake Michigan, and I could see the Green Bay. That's what it was. Now, some are coming back, yes, but you know, these forests are where the soil is kept. And when we do not have the soil in the forest, the soil leaves. It gets washed away. And the animals leave. And maybe you know this, but it's very difficult to put it back like it was. So she said, Jensen, you are aware of the ridges here. We called it the Bailey's Harbor area. She was very determined, not only protecting her property, that her father, who loved the forest, and never sold out, not an acre, and she wanted to protect this other part of Bailey's Harbor. Well, a whole lot of things happened. You see, it was federally owned for a while, and they gave that land to the county. And the county was going to make a campsite out of it. Now, some of us know where mosquitoes are born. And we thought, well, the joke will be on them when they're camping in the middle of a swamp. I could think of a few people that would go in there, and the mosquitoes would be so frustrated because those captains of industry, I don't think, had any blood in them. So, guess what? Albert Fuller from Milwaukee, he was a botanist. And he had very little hair on his head, and he was getting poor in the eyes. But boy, he knew detail. He could study a flower in such detail you never seen. And he could identify flowers we did not even know we were there. Now, Emma was pretty good at flowers, but she was self-taught mostly. And she wanted to preserve the flowers. So she would take Albert around, showing him where she had seen different colored flowers. You know what? He found over 25 orchids in these ridges along the lake. That's more than half of all the orchid species in Wisconsin, right here in this one place. Now, that is something that you should cherish, huh? Albert and I, we started giving tours and presentations. We would give educational talks all up and down the peninsula. We went down to even Green Bay and Milwaukee sometimes to tell people about this place. So in March 1937, Albert was speaking to the Women's Club of Sturgeon Bay. And in the audience were many park commissioner members, and we got rolling. You know what he said? We put it in a letter to the editor letter, and we all signed it. He said that this is such a precious place that if it is lost, the people of Bailey's Harbor will have lost a gem, a cherished thing. He also said that there were counties in the United States that would pay millions of dollars to recreate artificially what we had right here. And he's right. I'm telling you that. So guess what? The park commissioners, they want campground. Albert is not a man to be argued with. You see, he's younger than me. He's the same age as Emma. Emma is 30 years my junior. And they looked at Albert, and then they looked at me. And I looked right back at them. And I said, you listen to this man. He knows of what he speaks. And you know what they did? They listened. Emma rejoiced. She said, if the people rise up and want to get something done, they will get something done. And they designated that property as a sanctuary for wildflowers. How about that? Meanwhile, Emma had her own challenges with her property. In fact, back in 1926, I remember, she told me this, and I was here for some of it. The neighbor, who was a logger, he wanted to cut the trees down. So he said the property boundary was in the wrong place. It had been there since 1871. Well, he went back and forth and back and forth. And you know what? It went to the courts, and the court said, if the people who have owned this land before agreed that that line was correct, it's correct. Don't change it. So guess what? The logger did not get to cut down Emma's trees that day. So Emma and I, Olivia Traven, very determined woman, and half a dozen other men and women, some founders of Bailey's Harbor, saw that the articles were written up to save the ridges forever. Emma was recognized in the news and congratulated many things. And she said to me, I do not need an award. It is incumbent on us to do the right thing. You see, this is why Emma and myself are kindred spirits, because we see eye to eye on these things. She understands that we must go back to the soil and protect these lands. You know, one day I told her, when we build a building, we get a nail. And she said, yes, and when we build the building, we cut a tree. And she called that greed. Greed, 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 she would say. Oh, she was worse than me. You see, I had worked for the industrialists in Chicago and out of Ravinia, so I had to be a little bit careful around Emma, because some of the money that comes to fund the clearing, well, it comes from Henry Ford. I'll tell you about Henry in a minute. But the community here in Door County and in Bailey's Harbor pulled together and made this sanctuary. You see, you tell enough people, they will join you. You tell them the truth. Now, I just want to take you back to the Chicago group in Chicago for a moment, because Frank Lloyd Wright is there, Louis Sullivan is there, Ossian Cole Simons, my dear friend, who really thought cemeteries should be parks. And he's right, except, I must say, sometimes they do not inter the body deep enough, and when you're out having lunch, there's an unfavorable smell. And that can destroy your lunchtime if you're working in a factory. Although some of the factories in Chicago smell as bad as that. I'm very happy to be in Door County now. So, I will tell you this, though. We would argue around the table about the philosophy of what we were doing. Now, what did Walt Whitman say? Every blade of grass has an equivalent individual in society. You understand? We are all part of the whole. Yes? And Henry David Thoreau, we studied him, and he had the saying, simplify, simplify. But you know, he also said, do not first give me love. Do not give me money. Do not give me fame. Give me truth. Give me truth. And the truth is in the soil, and that's why we bring nature back to the people. You see? That's why it is so critical to protect these landscapes. It's so critical to incorporate these landscapes, not only into the parks, but into the buildings as well. This is what we taught the architects. They will not tell you that. They will tell you the other way around. Frank would say, you know, the building is the most important thing. And I would say, no, 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 the soil is the most important thing. And we would argue and argue and argue. And then Louis Sullivan would say, simplify. Well, I said to Frank Lloyd Wright one time, you got it wrong, Frank. Now, Frank believed everything he said was right, but it's not. I can tell you that from first-hand experience. So, I said to Frank, you know, Frank, first, you plant a cabbage. Then, you plant a flower, right? And after you have watched that flower grow, you plant a tree. When you have planted the tree and learned from that tree, then it is time to plant a city. Not before. So Frank has got it backwards. Well, when Anna Marie was alive, she said, I don't like Frank's buildings at all the roofs leak. I was down in Racine the other day, and I was seeing Herbert Johnson, one of the Johnsons. Frank designed their wing spread house, and it's a doozy, I tell you. It's big. And he's got all these windows up high. And he was having a big party there. Now, Herbert is he can be very intense because he has big responsibilities running this company that makes wax. And it's for floors. Maybe you heard of this thing, you know, Johnson wax stuff. He was having this party, and he was sitting at a table. And guess what happened? It started to rain. Whoa, no. And all up there are these windows, beautiful windows. They let the light in, and the house heats up like an oven. I'm telling you, Frank is not an engineer. So, well, two things he doesn't know. Well, the list is getting long. And so anyways, pretty soon a drop of water finds its way through the cracks around the window, right on Herbert's head. The room is silent. Even the governor is quiet. Everybody's wondering what Herbert's going to do. And he's sitting there, and you can see that he's just not a happy person. Hand me the phone, he says. Somebody brings the phone. Get me the exchange, he yells into the phone. I want to talk to Spring Green, Taliesin, and that architect, Frank Lloyd Wright. Now! And Frank answered the phone. Do you think he knew what was coming? Do you think Frank even cared? I don't think so, because he goes on the phone, and Herbert says, it is raining, I am having a party, and there's rain falling on my head, right where I am sitting. Do you know what Frank said to him? Move the chair. Well, you see, Frank calls himself an intuitive architect. Now, Anna Marie, when she was alive, very, very much understood intuition, because she said that I was sometimes a little too intuitive. Frank is an intuitive architect, and I pointed out to Anna Marie that water is intuitive. And since water is intuitive, that's why his roofs leak. Then he started calling himself an organic architect, because I guess the intuition was getting a little bit wet. So we would gather up here, and we would have philosophical discussions all over again at the clearing, and sometimes around the kitchen table in the Toft house. And oh, I love that little kitchen. You know, back in the 20s, they bought a Sears and Roebuck stove, what Emma called the Mayflower stove. She says it worked really fine. And I'm telling you, she could make those Swedish pancakes and put chopped up apples on them and some nutmegs with lots of butter, and I could stay there for a long time. That was very good. I know that Myrta is a good cook, but not as good as that. And oh boy, we would talk about all sorts of ways that we were directed to improve society. You see, when Emma got onto a subject or a cause, you better watch out, because she is not getting off it until it succeeded. She was a very determined woman, very smart, and she did not give up. that's because she was a Dane, you see. Lots of Danes up here. Lots of Danes in Racine, too. Like a lot of Danes. That's why I did those parks down there. And there were some in Chicago. In fact, when you think of it, there's immigrants all over the place in America. You know, even the native people came from someplace. So, you know, I hear people saying, we should restrict who should come in. Once I am in, don't let anybody else here. I don't care if you're the yellow race or the black race or any race. I don't care what language is what you speak. If you are to be so selfish to only let yourself in, then I do not believe that is America. I believe in everybody. Everybody should be allowed to come here. That means we have to put people places, huh? And where do we put people? Well, we put them in the cities, because that's where lots of jobs are, but then sometimes they come up to these places here. And this bothered Emma. She was worried that so many people would come to see her forest, or the ridges, that they would not know to lightly tromp in the forest, that we would kill the forest with love. And this was a real concern of hers. It troubled her. To this day, it still does. I was just talking to her, and she's looking at, you know, there will be somebody stopping by the roadside to pick some flowers, and she'll go out there and she'll tell them a thing or two. I think those people keep driving south till they hit the ocean. So I was teaching a lot of woodworking and such up at the clearing, and of course landscape architecture and philosophy and all of these things that we do. And I met this wonderful painter, Gerhard Miller. I just love his paintings. You know, he started out doing oils, but he was so busy tending to his father's affairs that he went to watercolors because they were cheaper and dried faster, but he's very good eye. And I asked him to teach at the clearing, and he did so for 8 years. He's going to do one more year, I think. When Gerhard and I were in the same room, those students didn't have a chance. Gerhard and I would start arguing about philosophy and this and how the light is coming through the trees and what does it mean when it hits your face and rejuvenates the soul. And the students would look at us like, what are you talking about, you old men? One day, one of the students came up to me and they said, Mr. Jensen, if I come to the clearing and graduate, right there, he had a problem. Will I become a great landscape architect? The other students knew better than to ask me that one. You know what I said to him? If you come to the clearing, you will learn not to ask that question. You see, the clearing is not a place. It is the clearing of the mind that allows you to communicate with the soil and understand yourself. This is what we must do. Now, one of my students, Alfred Caldwell, very bright, wonderful landscape architect, a dear friend still. He worked for me for a while, and he said, could I take a sabbatical, Jensen? And I said, sure. What do you want to do that you're not doing now? I could not believe that he would want to do something else, you see, because, well, we did everything. And he said, I would like to go to Taliesin, the Frank Lloyd Wright's school, and learn from the master. You see, Frank had a different philosophy. At Taliesin, you were not a student, you were an apprentice. Frank was not a teacher, he was the master. And he required you to call him the master. I think there's some issues there. Well, I don't know. You know, at the clearing, I do not really care what you call me. I just want you to find yourself. Because if you find yourself, you will then be able to excel at the choice of occupation or career that you choose. If you don't know who you are, how can you do that? Well, I let Alfred go to Taliesin. Very expensive, by the way. He lasted 2 weeks. And I must say, his wife, who was quite a woman, very astute, said, "You know, Mr. Jensen, I didn't trust Mr. Frank Lloyd Wright unless Alfred was by my side, because he has a reputation as a bit of a dandy." Now, that's not in the papers or nothing, but I've been to his parties, and wow, there's things going on there that we don't have at the clearing, I can tell you that. So, Emma and I, we saw each other all the time. Overjoyed with the religious sanctuary. She would be up there taking classes and doing some teaching as well. And we would come down to Toff Point. You say I've been painting a lot. I pay attention to the teachers that come to the clearing, because I learn too. And Gerhard Miller is very good at what he does. You know, he had polio as a child. And so it was hard for him to move around sometimes. Yeah. And he said that when he was a young boy, they would try to straighten out his feet and his legs so much that the thing that they had on the bed, his father called it the rack. And he said that on some occasions, his joints would actually dislocate, and he even had a snapped tendon one time. This is very painful. If a man can go through that and paint such beautiful pictures, you know that man has found himself. So I brought an easel out to Emma's place. You know, walking in the primeval forest there is something we do often. And she will walk through the woods, and I cannot hear her. I can hear the wind and the birds, the rustling of the branches. It is one of the most peaceful things I have ever experienced. Gerhard Miller taught us to see how light illuminates nature, but light not only illuminates nature, but it shows us its secret areas and creates mystery in the shadows, so that you want to go into nature and discover something new. And in discovering something new, you find a truth. And that truth will impart something into you that you can use in whatever you choose to do in life. It teaches us that way. I set up my easel on a point of rocks that we often sat on. We sat on that rock many times and would talk philosophy. I remember one time, the waves are lapping rhythmically onto the rock, sounding very irregular and beautiful. And Emma started to hum. And she is humming her own song that only she can hear because of nature's harmony, you see. And then she looks at me and she says, "Jensen, hum, you too." Okay. I started humming. Pretty soon we are singing at the top of our lungs to the waves and to the wind and to the call of the birds. And we're looking across Mud Bay at the beautiful green carpet on the other side with not a single house. We are in a place where we can see no other people. If you can discover these places in your life, cling to them, preserve them, and hold them in your heart. So there were 2 trees there, out on this rock. One was a white spruce. It was not that big, but bigger than the cedar next to it. Now, Emma is a tall woman, but she is willowy and lithe and flows in the wind. And I was reminded one time, a friend of mine that I met in Chicago, Sybil Shear. Do you know of her? She's a dancer. And she comes up to the clearing now and then, and she and Emma are friends, and she dances. But it is a dancing that is like nature. She will put her arms and her legs in a position that seems as if she has no bones. And she will look like a tree, or the branch of a tree. And then the branch is blown this way by the wind, and she will react and do that as well. And she will dance in the lodge, and she will dance in the council rings on the clearing. And we will be so rejoicing in this beautiful outpouring of artistic gift. She is my woodland nymph. But Emma is my soulmate. So I painted these two trees. She said I brag sometimes, but I called them Jens and Emma. But you know what I did? I painted them so it is as if they are in a storm right now. And their branches are moving and blowing this way. And when Olivia Traven saw this, she said, "Why did you paint them that way?" Because we are two Danes in a storm trying to hang on. And the storm is civilization. And this is the force that we resist or turn to good purpose. Do you understand? Does this make sense to you? We are part of nature. You know that. And we are part of the cities. So how we blend these two things is how we convey our ethic to the rest of the world and to our children especially. Now, there's this guy over in central Wisconsin. He writes stuff in a shack. I have my cliff house. You know, when the clearing is a little too busy and I have to get away from all the people up there, I go to my cliff house. It was a long time before anybody knew I had it. I sleep down there, and I sometimes just listen to the waves below the cliff. But this man, Aldo Leopold out there, he said that if you do something does not enrich the land, then it is not the right thing to do. This is a common sense thing, I think, huh? So you realize that a lot of the philosophy that we in this conservation world practice is indeed common sense. So I finished the painting and I gave it to Emma. She quite liked it. And I said to her, you know, I know that you had a boyfriend way back when you were teaching in Rowley's Bay. She was very young then. But he was called off to war, and he did not come back. She cried and cried. She was very young. These things that happen, we can bring them into our hearts and use them to make us better, or we can fall away. She brought that into her heart. It gave her focus. Oh, she said there was somebody else that was courting her, but she never wrote him back. And I said, so you do not need a husband. And she said, Jensen, look about you. Look at this primeval forest. What man could ever fulfill me so much as this forest? And then she gave me a hug. And she said, well, maybe you. And she gave me the lightest kiss on my cheek. It was like a hummingbird had breezed by. But you see, she has a higher purpose. And if we all have higher purpose, think what we can do. Huh? Because there is only a few things in life we can truly love. And to truly love these things takes all of our concentration and energy. And that love gives back to us and imparts experience and knowledge that helps us become better caretakers of the land. You know, I go down to the cliff every night to see the sunset. And you can feel the breeze on your face. Let it blow to you. And you can feel the fathers and the mothers and the sons and the daughters of the Eskimos in their igloos far in the North Country. And you can feel them because the wind that kisses their cheek is the same wind that kisses mine. Thank you very much. Thank you. I have been instructed by the poet, Nancy Raphael, that I must answer some questions. So if you have one or two or 5 or 10, we will do that now. But otherwise, we missed the sunset tonight, but the lake is still beautiful, so there we go. Yes, sir.
What about Henry?
Oh, Henry Ford. Oh, yes. I almost forgot about Henry. Well, you know, Henry has this house in Fairlane outside of Detroit. And when you go up to it, the Rogue River comes around a bend, just so. And the house is on a hill, just so. And it creates what is an illusion of the optics, and it looks like the house is crooked. So the architects did not know what to do with this, and one of them, very wisely, said, "Call Jensen, he'll fix it." Well, I went down there, and I had a good laugh when I saw that, because they did not think about anything of how it looked. They just thought of the inside. Well, So he says, Jensen, I will hire you and you will fix this. And I said, I am sorry, Mr. Ford. I cannot work for you. Now, Mr. Ford is a man used to getting his own way, and he does not hear no very often. But I said no to him. And he said, why not? And I said, you know, you are an industrialist, and I am an artist. We will never agree. What would you do, Jensen, if I did hire you? Well, this was easy. I said I would bring the land back to what it was when the Indians skidded down the slope in the snow in the winter and walked down to go fishing in the summer. That's what I would do. You know what he said? Do it. He had me there. So, well, I landscaped the property, and the way the house sits, I created a winding road to create mystery before you see this house. It's quite a castle, but as you walk inside to the entryway, there is a music conservatory room that faces to the west. So I thought, you know, Mr. Ford will come in here every day. So I made a clearing so that on a solstice, there would be sun coming into that room. And you know what he did? He said, Jensen, many days in the summer, when I come in after working in the factory, I walk in and I stop suddenly because of the glow, the warm orange washing over me through that window. And sometimes, Jensen, I stand there for 10, 15 minutes and I think about my place in nature. Can you imagine an industrialist thinking that? That was a good one. Thank you. Yeah.
What were the names of some of the parks that you created in Chicago?
Oh, well, Humboldt. Oh, I have a wonderful story about one of the parks where I made a waterfall. Garfield Park. So Garfield Park, do you notice? I put a waterfall in there, and the waterfall was supposed to be a prairie river. And the prairie river, as I described earlier, just goes down the layers of rocks very peacefully. Well, the workmen did not understand this, and I come in to see this waterfall. They said they had finished it. And it is this cascade of roaring water like in a mountain river in the Rocky Mountains. And I said, you haven't got it. They took it apart, and they did it again. And do you know what they did? The same thing! You haven't got it, I said. And the worker said, Jensen, I don't understand what you want. And I said to him, do you know Mendelssohn's Spring Song? Yes. Do you know how to play Mendelssohn's Spring Song? No! Does your wife know how to play Mendelssohn's Spring Song? No! Do you know anyone who can play Mendelssohn's Spring Song for you? And he says, well, my wife's sister Mina can play it. You go home tonight. You go over to your wife's sister Mina's house and have her play Mendelssohn's Spring Song 4 times. He goes home and he tells his wife, Jensen's cracked. He's lost his mind. He's working too hard, too much to do. So, you know what his wife said? Very wise woman. Maybe Jensen has a point. So they go over to Mina's, and Mina plays. No. 4 times, Jensen said. No. This is enough. And his wife says, 4 times. Play it one more. I understand what Jensen is saying. He goes back to Garfield Park and he makes the waterfall. And I come in the next day and the water is tinkling over the layers of limestone, ever so gently and quietly. And I say, you've got it. You've got it. You see, when you listen to nature, it tells you. So Garfield Park, please go. It's one of my favorites. Yes, sir.
It's my understanding at the Ford estate that Mrs. Ford had always on that, well, roses.
Don't get me going on the roses. No, no, not the roses. Henry is bad enough, but Mrs. Ford, you know what she did? She built these raised bed square, and then she put roses in the middle of my clearing. I cannot abide by this. I had him take them out. This is not something that I can put up with. So do not bring that up again. No roses in my clearing. Do you have another question that's not so disruptive?
I studied under Nice Emperor.
Ah,
I was the last graduating class with Nice, IIT. It was my understanding that Caldwell, he actually used Caldwell as a landscape architect on his buildings. Did you know that or no?
Well, you know, Alfred, we stay in touch. Yeah. Alfred's very good. Alfred's very good. And so you must be very good too.
I guess.
He's a humble man, just like a Dane. There you go. You are okay in my book. All right. Thank you very much.